this, but she'll probably never watch. Her name is Hunter. All right? Her dad was a big-time hunter. Big game hunter, named her Hunter. And from the time she was old enough to hold a pop gun, she was a hunter. And raised her hunting and big game hunting, and all of her little pictures, they would post pictures and she'd have all her big game that she'd killed. And 10 years old, 8 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old, and all she would come to church and she had her baseball cap on, her camos on, and I mean, she's a scary girl, you know. And her freshman year, we all, you know, school's out, and she summer happens of her freshman year. She's going to start high school. And she walked back in that next fall. You know, people go on in the summer and they come back into youth group. And she comes into church and nobody knew who she was. Here's this beautiful girl, long blonde hair, because she never pulled it out of her cap. Long blonde hair, wearing a dress and makeup. And we're like, who? Not kidding you, nobody really knew who she was. So from years, you know, 0 to 13, she was scary. Years 14 to 18, she was one of the most beautiful girls you've ever seen. Always prettied and dressed up and fancied and went to all the, just fantastic. And then graduated high school, went on to college, and we're all wondering what is going to happen. We never know what this girl's going to do. I get my kids post, this has been a while, but about 2 years ago. You're never going to guess what Hunter's going to school for. She's about to graduate. Take a guess. She's going to be a mortician. Now, knowing her story, it fits. But she's going to be the prettiest mortician you've ever seen. I mean, you talk about a complete transformation. But listen. Guys didn't date her because they were afraid of her. Because she knew how to kill you and dress you like you didn't know. And she's something else. But what a great young lady. She's one of our best friends. We're great family friends. What a wonderful lady that she's become. You ever known anybody like that? Maybe for you it was somebody who went into the military. You know, they go in one way, and 4 years later they come out, and you go, "Wow, you changed." You know, or maybe it's college, or maybe they move away with a career, and a couple years later they come back, and you think, "Wow, you have really changed. You've gone through this incredible personal transformation." Question. Here's your pop quiz for the day. When did Saul become the Apostle Paul? It's a trick question. When did Saul become the Apostle Paul? Now you're thinking, well, when he went through that transformation on the road to Damascus. We're going to talk a little bit about that this morning. No? Actually, the trick question is, we don't know. Because it doesn't tell us. What you get is in Acts chapter 13, suddenly there's this reference, he's become a follower of Jesus Christ, and he's going along, and all of a sudden it just says randomly, Saul, who's also called Paul. And that's it. That's all you get. And then as you follow his life story, it refers to him as Paul, and Paul, and Paul. We don't really know. But there was definitely a time, and if you've got your Bibles, and in there I put an outline on the back of your order of service here. I've titled this series that we're doing here through January, New Beginnings. It's a great time to do it. It's a great time to talk about starting over and starting new, and how we're anticipating some transformations in our life, and God's going to do some different things, and life's going to change. And we all know it. And so I want to talk with you about that, and we're looking at some different characters and different stories of people as we go down through here in the next few weeks about new beginnings for people. And so this morning I want to talk to you about Saul, who then becomes and is known as Paul. If you got your outlines, turn to Philippians chapter 3, verses, we're going to start in verse 4, and we're going to kind of go on through the text. But we'll read the first few verses there, verses 4 to 6, and then we'll begin. He says, this is Paul, Saul, though I myself have reasons for such confidence, if anyone else thinks he has reasons to put confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, in regard to the law, a Pharisee. As for zeal, persecuting the church. As for legalistic righteousness, faultless. Now, here's what I'm trying to show you. In this new beginnings, you've kind of got this before and after look with Paul and Saul and Paul. That's why I put both names up there. Before, known as Saul. After, known as Paul. Here's the thing. Before he met Christ, here's what I put in your outline. Self-righteous. Self-righteous. That's Saul. What you get in verse 5 there, he describes himself, and I kind of put a little colored bullets there just so that you could kind of keep track with where I'm going with this. But that first line there is elite. He perceived himself, he was part of the elite. Verse 5, he describes himself. He says, I was circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin. What's he telling you? He's in the elite group. When he describes himself as circumcised on the 8th day, he's telling you, I'm an Israelite. I'm a Jew. I followed the law. My parents followed the law. We went through we followed it. I am Jewish. Circumcised on the 8th day according to the law. We followed all of it. He is circumcised. He says, I'm of the tribe of Israel. In fact, he says, I'm of the tribe of Benjamin. Now that might ring a bell for you. Do you know who the number one Benjamite was? King Saul. He was named after. Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin. Saul was named after King Saul because he was of the tribe of Benjamin. He's telling you, I come from the elite group. We're somebody. And everybody knows it. He says, before that self-righteous attitude, he says, I was in the in group. I'm part of the elite. And he described, by the way, have you ever been not in the in group? Ever been a part of that? Not included? Not, he says, maybe for you it was a language issue, and you realize very quickly, I'm not in. I don't speak the language. In all my traveling around the world, I learned very quickly it pays to speak the language or to travel with somebody who does. Because you're all of a sudden, you realize very quickly, you are not in the in group. There's some countries that are better at it than others, but wow, you're not in. It's a language thing. Or it's an education thing. What school did you graduate from? Well, does it matter? Yeah, for some people. Depending on where you live in the country and what school you may or may not go to. And I'm not talking about ASU and U of A. You can all just relax for a minute. We're not talking about that. We're talking about Ivy League. Did you graduate from an Ivy League school? I mean, that's what they want to know. Sometimes it's education. Sometimes it's language. Sometimes it's clothes. Do you remember when now maybe you didn't do this, but you got to have all the right stuff. You know what I just found out? The most important gift this Christmas? You know what it was? I've forgotten the name of it. The flask. You know what I'm talking about? The Hydro Flask. See, some of you gave it to your kids, didn't you? I found out the couple days after Christmas, apparently everybody who's anybody got a Hydro Flask. I didn't know that. Well, I had to go get one for my daughter. She had to have one because everybody else in the group had one. You ever been out of the in group? Paul says he was a part of the elite group. He was in. Circumcised, 8th day of the tribe of Israel. He was a Benjamite. I would also say that before he met Christ, not only was he considered himself elite, but he also was very prideful. He describes himself as a Hebrew of Hebrews. Here's what that means. He means generationally. He is generationally from a Hebrew, from a Hebrew, from a Hebrew, from a Hebrew. He's Hebrew. And getting more Hebrew than he is. He is a Hebrew of Hebrews. From generation to generation, he's in the line. I've been very tempted to go on that. You know, they have different websites now, Ancestry.com and all these. I think I know who I am, but I kind of want to know. As I know I'm not a Hebrew of Hebrews. Your ancestry, you may be able to track your ancestry, whether it's Chinese, you may be able to go way back. Maybe it's Vietnamese, maybe it's Burmese, maybe it's whatever it may be. And you can track your ancestry. You know what it is. Japanese, you know. He says, we have a very long history of who we are. I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews. It was a pride thing for him. Years ago, they had a cultural thing at my child's school, and we told my daughter they had to bring food. So my daughter brought Swedish meatballs. And because we thought we had Swedish in our family. Turns out they were just the in-laws. You know, she had to go back and explain after she got a good grade on the paper that she wasn't Swedish. You know, my family's, English dominant on both sides, and Hispanic, Mexican, Mexico, but then Spanish and Indian, and then there's apparently, and then we're Irish and Dutch on my wife's side, and Native American, and I kind of want to go find out who I am and who my kids are. It's getting kind of complicated. Paul was not that way. Paul says, I'm generationally Hebrew. I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews. There was, prior to meeting Christ, self-righteousness. He says in verse 6, he was, as for zeal, Paul, legalistic righteousness, as it relates to following the rules and regulations, he says he was faultless. Now, get your mind around that. 600 plus rules, and he was pretty good at them. He says, faultless. Oh, I'm sorry, that was prideful was the second dot. The third dot there is a legalistic righteousness. He had legalistic righteousness. He had it down. He was educated to that point. If you follow his story, you kind of track down Acts chapter 22, talks about how he was trained under Gamaliel. Gamaliel was the leading rabbi of the era. He was the man. If you were going to be trained by anybody, if you're going to get educated by anybody, you went to Jerusalem and were trained by Gamaliel. You followed him. He was the rabbi. And Paul was his student. It says Galatians chapter 1 describes him as, he says he had advanced beyond his peers. He was the guy who set the curve in the class. You ever have one of those guys or girls? Made you mad every time they took a test? Because you knew that the curve just went like this? That was Paul. He says he advanced beyond all of his peers under Gamaliel. He was the man. He had a legalistic righteousness. He was trained. He says, in verse 6, he says he was extremely zealous in persecuting the church because he believed that they were the rebels, that they were the people that needed to be put away. They were ruining the faith. The last dot under there is just, not only was he elite and prideful and legalistic and had a legalistic righteousness, but he was a zealot. And he, in the day, he thought that was a good thing. Meaning he was persecuting the church. Verse 6, as for zeal, persecuting the church. He was the standard bearer for destroying the sect that was threatening Judaism. He was the guy. He was the man. He was the one that everybody turned to and said, here, you can do this. You can take care of this. And he did. Acts chapter 26 describes him as hunting down Christians from door to door, city to city. Hunting them down, imprisoning them, taking them back to Jerusalem, trying them, and then executing them. He was a persecutor of the church. He was really the shining example of the do-it-yourself religion. In other words, he had it all down. Everything was nice and neat and tidy. He followed all the rules. He was the legalistic. He was the Pharisee of Pharisees. He was the epitome. He was at the top of the game, and everybody knew who he was. He was the man, the self-righteous man. And then in Acts chapter 9, he meets Jesus. Now, we don't have time for that. That's a whole other sermon at a different time. But he meets Jesus in Acts chapter 9. On his way, do you remember the story? He's actually traveling 150 miles to hunt Christians. He's been given the authority to arrest them in whatever territory they may be in. Damascus is not in Jerusalem. It's 150 miles away north in a different territory. But he was given the authority to go up, find them, imprison them, and bring them back to Jerusalem to be tried and executed. And the text says, men and women. He was bad news. But he was all doing it under the guise of self-righteousness. He was elite, he was prideful, he was legalistic, he was a zealot. But read what happens next now as you get down verse 7 now and following. But whatever, now this is his assessment, all right? After, we're skipping forward in the story, all right? Because he's writing in Philippians. He meets Jesus on the road to Damascus. God intervenes. The story goes that God blinds him with a light, speaks to him. He immediately recognizes. And Jesus, who are you, Lord? I'm Jesus. And he has a faith experience with Jesus Christ. Becomes a follower of Jesus Christ. Verse 7 and 8. But whatever was to my profit, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ. What is more, I consider everything a loss compared to the surpassing greatness of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. I consider them rubbish that I may gain Christ. I just got back. I was telling Miss Janie, got back from Tucson. We were there Thursday. I went Thursday afternoon, evening, Friday, and then came back on Saturday to my mother's house in Tucson because the house has now been vacated and we had to clean out the house. And all of the stuff and all the belongings. My brother, when we started talking about what we were going to do, and there's 5 siblings, one was not able to come. He's too far in Northwest and Idaho. And so the other 4 siblings and whoever else could come were going to come down and clean out the house. My brother got one of those commercial dumpsters. I'm not talking about the one that you get at the back of your business. I'm talking about the 10 by 10 by 20. Huge, that they roll in with the big thing and and that was what we started using. There were 5 of us that spent 3 hours cleaning up the outside around the property, which had become a dump. We filled up a third of that dumpster with outside rubbish and trash. A third of it. 5 of us going to town for 3 hours. Got it all, that part of the outside of the cleaned up. And then a couple more siblings came, and so we had about 8 of us on the inside of the house for the next 5 hours. And most of this, there were a lot of the things that had been taken out by the previous people that were there. And we were just kind of going through and sorting everything. Yes, we're keeping it. No, we're not keeping it. Maybe we're keeping it. And the stuff all went out into the garage. That we took everything out of the house. Everything. Boxed up everything out of the house, put it up into the garage. And as we're doing that, we're throwing stuff in the dumpster. That's the no. We did that for 5 hours, and the next day we did it for another 3 or 4. We filled that dumpster. Now, I got to tell you, that was a very odd experience. Maybe you've done it. Maybe you've gone through this. That was probably the oddest experience I've ever had. Because I'm thinking about the process, how disturbing it was to value, to evaluate, to assess life in a matter of hours. What are you going to keep? What are you not going to keep? What's of value and what's not of value? We literally filled up that big of a dumpster in a few hours. A lifetime in a few hours. Now, here's kind of the happy part. That's mine. Everybody else had theirs. Mine never showed up for years. For 20 years, 30 years, 40. How long ago did I leave? That was a long time ago. I found this. That's my stocking. You know how long I've been without a stocking in my house? That's going up next year. This, my grandmother made for all of us children. There were 5 of them. They were in my mother's stuff. Everybody's got one. My grandmother. So I went through in her drawer. Now, by the way, all the siblings had whatever vehicles, whatever they had, just cars and things. And the idea was you took, because we were doing it in 2 days, take whatever you want. We don't care. Just take anything that means anything to you. Okay? I have my Toyota Corolla, right? So you're about to get the idea. This is a watch that I found in her drawer. Hers. My mother's. Little pocket watch. It still works. It's been there for 50, 60, I don't know how long. We never saw it. You know, when you go through that process, you discover there are only a few things that are really valuable. Huh? Only a few things. Wow. That's my mother's Bible. I got this one. My oldest brother got the oldest Bible that was given to her by her parents. And I got hers that we grew up with. This was hers. I brought home what I could shove in my Corolla. And that's pretty much all that means anything to me. It's not monetary value, is it? The things that are really important to you, Bible, pictures, family pictures, a few things that remind you of what really is important. Paul says, you see the verse? Whatever was to my profit, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ. I consider everything a loss compared to the surpassing greatness of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. I consider them rubbish, that I may gain Christ. Paul looks at his whole life and everything that he's ever done throughout his life, and all he can say is at the end, it's all just loss. It doesn't mean anything to me compared to Christ. It doesn't mean anything. I've assessed my life. And I've figured out what the most important things are. And I've held on to them. Paul says, I've already thrown it out. He's experienced a massive value faith shift in his life. And he describes it in verse 9. Look at it. To be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ. The righteousness that comes from God and is by faith. I said in your outline there, that little dot is supposed to say righteousness by faith. That's what Paul came across with. He says, all those other things, that which I thought I was elite and I was prideful and I was legalistic to the core and I was a zealot. He said, all that stuff, everything I thought was important is gone. That I may understand righteousness by faith. He had a value shift. He went from a works-based achievement-based religion, he said, that I found to be worthless compared to knowing Christ. He left all of those things that he said made him feel important in order to gain Christ by faith. He says, I want to know, as you go on to the verse 10, I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, and so somehow to attain to the resurrection from the dead. I want to know, what was that power that raised Jesus from the dead? I want to know what that is. I want to know what it is to understand, to have that fellowship, to understand what it means to suffer with Christ. To surrender his life for the resurrected life. He says, I gave up all that was before. I gave it all up in order that I might obtain life. Righteousness by faith. He says, as you read through some of Paul's story in his life in Acts chapter 3, there's a group of people who are fussing over who's important, who's really important. And people in the church were going, well, I follow Apollos. And another one said, well, I follow Peter. And, well, I follow Paul. And Paul says, you guys got it all wrong. And he describes himself and the other leaders. He goes, we're just servants. And the word is slaves. It said in your outline, slave to everyone. Paul says, we're just servants. We're just slaves. It's all about Jesus Christ. It's not about us. We don't care who the leader is. That doesn't matter. It's about righteousness by faith. It's not about all that other stuff, the elite and the prideful and the legalistic and all. He says, it's not about that. He says, it's about us being servants of Jesus Christ. If you've got your Bibles, I want to show you that passage there, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, because it talks a little bit about, he uses that phrase. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. I want to read that section to you, verses 19 to 23. Here's what he says. Though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To the Jew I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak to win the weak. I had become all things to all men so that by all possible means I might save some. I do this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. Paul, the guy who gave it all up, and it was all about power and all about authority and all about, he says, I gave all of that up that I might become a slave to everyone. I've become all things so that I might win some. I remember when many years ago, I was studying about, I remember Paul describes himself as a Pharisee of Pharisees. I mean, years ago, I remember looking up and studying the Pharisees and finding out what they believed and what they did. And I came to this really weird moment where I said, I think I might be a Pharisee. They were conservative. They believed in the sovereignty of God and the choice, the decision of man, the necessity of that. They believed in angels. They believed in the supernatural. They believed in the resurrection. And as I went down the list of all the things the Pharisees, I thought, I think I was raised to be a Pharisee. Pretty similar. Oh, by the way, they were very self-righteous. Oh, that's probably not good. Probably not. There's a temptation. The same temptation that Paul faced. You know, when you're pretty good about following the rules, and you got pretty good theology, and you're able to put everything in a nice, neat little box in your Christian faith, it's very easy to become self-righteous because everything fits. Paul says, I gave that up. I gave up that whole idea of self-righteousness and obtaining some kind of value and sense of self-worth based on how I could perform and how many boxes I could check and because I was really what I was doing was trying to earn God's favor by the life that I lived. And he goes, I woke up one day and realized it's not about my righteousness. It's about Christ's righteousness. It's about faith. Let me ask you this. If you could only take what you could fit in your Corolla, what would you take? What would be left? What would you give up? If in a matter of hours you had to decide what was the most important thing and you could only take what you could fit in a box, what would you take? You would take things that were the most important things. Fits in a box. Lasts forever. Changes your life forever. Your faith in Jesus Christ changes everything. My 14-year-old daughter was with me as my siblings and I are sitting around the table doing what we do best, which is pick at each other. And we're all picking and poking, and every time somebody walks into the room, they're next, and we pick at them. Just teasing each other, just having a blast. And my youngest daughter said to me after we had left, she goes, do you guys always pick on? I said, look, we're equal opportunity pickers. We pick on everybody. We don't care. We love each other. We're just teasing, just having fun. She goes, that was really fun watching you guys have fun. I said, yeah, that's just kind of how we are. We've been that way our whole lives. We love being together when we're together, which isn't very often. She says, do you think we'll have that someday? 4 kids in my family. She says, you think we'll be like that someday? I said, I think so. Probably. Because the most important thing isn't a money valuation. It's a spiritual valuation. It's what lasts forever. It's your faith in Jesus Christ. It's your family. It's your relationships. It's stuff that you don't pack in the box. You take it with you. This stuff just reminds me of the most important stuff. I didn't need a lot to take. What would you take? Father, thank you for this morning and for an opportunity to be reminded of what's most important and an opportunity to be reminded that it's not about a self-righteousness, a righteousness that we can work for and earn and deserve, but it's about faith. It's a righteousness that comes by faith. It's about our relationship with Jesus Christ. It's about the most important things in this world. I ask you as you about to close here in just a minute in prayer, but with your heads bowed, eyes closed, let me say this to you as a challenge for you. As you think about what's most important in your life, and maybe you felt like I did. Maybe you had a little bit of, man, I've lived my life one way all these years. And really, it's all stuff that's lost. Doesn't add up. Doesn't mean anything. Doesn't amount to anything. Doesn't value anything. It's just lost.